I'm ready to bind off. This pattern doesn't actually mention binding off, but you always have to bind off the knitting. That will lock off all the stitches and finish the project. So we definitely need to do that. After you have worked your way back down all those different stitch patterns and done garter stitch, so you've got a second 6-inch section of everything except for the rib stitch, which only happens once, then it's time to bind off. You will probably have plenty of yarn at this point, and you might wonder, should I be binding off? And the reason why you have plenty of yarn is because there are these fringes, and so you're going to need some yarn to do those. You don't have to do them. You can opt to leave it plain. You could perhaps make some pom-poms and attach those. There are lots of options, but the reason why there's so much yarn left over at this point is because they're expecting you to do those fringes. So here is how to bind off. You are faced with a needle full of stitches here, and the first thing you're going to do is knit 2 stitches. And the reason why it's 2 is so that you can do the bind off, and the bind off is snagging the right hand stitch and lifting it up, over, and off the needle. And that is 1 stitch bound off. And for the rest of the bind off procedure, you will just knit 1, and now you're up to 2 stitches again, and you're going to take it down to 1 stitch by inserting your needle into the right hand stitch and pulling it up, over, and off the needle. That's 2 bound off. And here's a third one. Add a stitch and take a stitch away. And I can show you with my right hand. The thing about binding off is that it's easy to make it too tight. And I will tell you how to avoid that. The first thing is, as you're doing the knit, be gentle and loose with your yarn. Don't tug on it too hard. Just wrap it gently around the needle and pull it through. Now, when you have 2 stitches on the needle, make sure there's some space in between them, at least as much as the yarn is thick. Sort of like when we were casting on, if you remember, we wanted to keep space between the stitches on the needle so that things would not be too tight, and it's the same thing here. And then you pull up, over, and off. So just be gentle, take it slow. After you've done 4 or 5, maybe give it a tug and see how's it going. The bind off is always, or usually, a little tighter than the fabric, and that's okay. But if it just doesn't stretch at all, if it just feels like a steel band, that's probably not what you want. And if at this point it's a little steel band-like, don't worry about it. Leave those stitches there. Just do your best to make the next stitches looser. Just be gentle with it, and you'll be fine. I'm going to bind off the rest of this row, and I'll see you back at the very end of it so you can see what happens then. Here we are at the final stitch to bind off, so I'll knit it, pull this one up, over, and off, and now I'm left with a single stitch on my right hand needle. And the way I handle it is to pull up on this needle, get that stitch to be nice and big, and then I can set the needle aside. I am going to clip my yarn, leaving myself a nice long tail, 6 to 8 inches. And here's that loop that was on the needle, but is big enough now to accommodate my fingers. I'll put my fingers in the loop, grasp the yarn, and pull it through the loop and tighten down to make a little knot. And that is secure, although you will weave the tail in, or if you're opting to do the fringe, this could become part of your fringe. Something I wanted to point out, the bind off looks different on both sides. I was looking at the right side when I did it, and I was binding off knitwise, or I was knitting the stitches as I went across the row. And you can see these sideways V's. That's the appearance that you get on the side you were looking at when you were binding off. On the other side, it looks rather more like the stitches below it. And you might like this better, this appearance better on the right side of your fabric. And if you do, then bind off knitwise, knit each stitch as you're binding off, but do it when you're looking at the wrong side of your fabric. And once again, the easiest way to tell which is the wrong side and the right side is to look at this stockinette section, because it will be the most obviously different on the two sides.